In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. So tonight we're going to begin a new course that we'll entitle Our Struggle. Our struggle is the term traditionally used by the genuine Orthodox Christians in Greece as the term describing their witness against ecumenism and modernism, against the new calendar, and their efforts to fight for orthodoxy. And it has been a struggle. And of course, throughout the true Orthodox world, it's a great struggle to witness to our faith and then to fend off the accusations against us by those in official or state-approved orthodoxy, or you might say New York Times-approved orthodoxy, accusing us of being schismatics and canonical and all those things. And I think it's good for us to go back and do some homework and recall the fundamental ecclesiological principles and the canons on the basis of which our fathers in the faith justly and necessarily broke communion with the innovators and apostates of the official ecclesiastical structures. So when you tell your friends who are in the New Calendar Church or World Orthodoxy that, yes, I'm with this true Orthodox synod, they often the arguments they come back with are on a very low level. They'll be emotional, or they're just painted with a very broad brush. Well, you're just uncanonical, or you're weird, or whatever, and something very ignorant. But there have been attempts, and there are still stubborn attempts by so-called conservative World Orthodox or so-called conservative New Calendarists to make an argument that even though they know that, they know very well that the official patriarchates have been involved in heresy, and for a long time now, for decades now, that there's still no canonical justification for breaking communion with them. So the fundamental thesis of people like Father Peter Heers, for example, or the Father Vasilios Grigoriatis, who is the writer that our author, Bishop Maximus, is going to reply to in the article we're going to study. The fundamental article is, yes, they are heretics, and yes, you must stay with them to be in the church. That's the bottom line of their ecclesiology. Yes, they are heretics, and yes, you must stay with them, and yes, you must acknowledge that they are your lawful bishops, and you can't leave them until there's an ecumenical synod, finally a long-awaited eighth ecumenical council, which we haven't had since the era of the emperors, and which alone will have the authority to authorize you to break communion with the heretics. Of course, I mean, when stated that baldly, it's obviously absurd, but that is the bottom line of their ecclesiological position. But let's go back and review this. I'm going to go through paragraph by paragraph. This is an article by then Hieromonk, now Bishop Maximus of the Genuine Orthodox Church of Greece, the synod that our parish, St. Hieromonk, belongs to under our Bishop Meshwan Demetrius. He wrote this when he was still a Hieromonk, but he's now a bishop, so we'll refer to the author as Bishop Maximus. And he's replying to a specific article. This article is an article called the Anti-Patristic, the Stance of the Zealot Old Calendarists. They love to throw the term zealot at us. Of course, zealot actually is a term of approbation. The early fathers, Manathos, for example, who did not accept the calendar innovation from 1924 on, and who to this day do not commemorate the ecumenical patriarch, they are called the zealots, and they'll say, "Yes, I'm a zealot." So it's, but in the mouth of, or by the pen of someone like this Father Vasilios Basil, it's a slur, right? Zealot, you can imagine a wild-eyed fanatic with his, burning eyes and his hair sticking out, like he's been stuck his finger in a 220 socket, his hair sticking out, and he's raving and slavering and ready to bite your head off because you ate oil in a wind state or something like that. So it's a term they use. But so the title of this article is "The Anti-Patristic, the Stance of the Zealot Old Calendarists." We're not going to study Father Basil's article because Bishop Maximus is going to quote the salient points and he's going to refute them. Okay, but Father Basil's article is useful because it does summarize anything that's close to a conservative New Calendarist refutation of our position or attack on our position. And it's essentially the same as that being propagated now by the unfortunate Father Peter Heers. So these are the only even plausible objections they can never make to our position. So it's very useful to go through a refutation of the points from Father Basil's article. Our author begins, "In every age the devil tempts the faithful by various means, persecutions, foreign invasions, lure of worldly seduction, and so forth. Among his most effective snares are heresy and schism, which by separating Christians from the church lead them away from Christ into spiritual deception and apostasy. Long is the list of heresies which have tried the church over the centuries: Arianism, Nestorianism, monophysitism, iconoclasm, papism, Protestantism, and many others. In our day, a new heresy has appeared which seeks to bring all these together, and for this reason is aptly referred to as a pan-heresy." I think the first person to use the term is the late Father Justin Popovich, Serbia. I believe he coined the term pan-heresy. This is ecumenism, which we may briefly define as the belief that sects which the Church had previously considered heretical and cut off from her are in fact in some way still part of her. The threat ecumenism poses to the Church is perhaps greater than that of any heresy of the past for two reasons. So he's saying this is worse. You thought Arianism was bad, you thought iconoclasm was bad, this is worse. Why? First, by far the largest part of the Church has succumbed to its temptation. The vast majority, 90%, over 90% of people that are formally styled Orthodox are under the hierarchies that have joined ecumenism, that are either in ecumenism or in communion with those in ecumenism. So this is indeed unprecedented. When there was a short period in the 4th century when the world woke up and groaned to find itself Arian, in St. Jerome's memorable phrase, but that didn't last very long. That was because that just lasted a few decades. But the ecumenism thing's been going on for 100 years now, and it's not stopping. It's just getting worse. Second, the effect of ecumenism is to negate the underlying concept of orthodoxy and the concept of heresy as the Church has understood them. This is really the root problem. They're now saying that heresy doesn't matter. That's the problem with ecumenism. It's theological indifferentism is at the root of this. Yes, we have these old dogmas and so forth, but we have to love everyone. The late lamented Patriarch Athenagoras from the 1950s and 60s, the first one, the one to lift the anathemas and pray with Pope Paul VI, openly said, dogmas don't matter, it's love what counts. Love, some new conception of love that doesn't involve truth, right? Like the Beatles song, love is all you need. They say he was in the Beatles' decade, is in the 1960s. So it's this conception of love without truth. He goes on, despite the spread of ecumenism, in most local churches, a remnant of the faithful has remained steadfast in orthodoxy. These faithful Christians are known as the true Orthodox or the traditionalist Orthodox, sometimes the Old Calendarists. The latter name, Old Calendarists, is used because one of the first manifestations of ecumenism was the change of the Church's liturgical calendar to correspond to that of the Papists and the Protestants. Since the papal calendar had long been condemned by the Church, the Orthodox rejected it when the new calendarists adopted it, and they severed communion with the bishops who promoted it. Okay. So this terminology of Old Calendarist is a nickname. The name of our church in Greece is the Church of the Genuine Orthodox Christians of Greece. Gnision Orthodoxon, of the genuine Orthodox. But Old Calendarist is a nickname. It originally was kind of a slur. Those Old Calendarists, they worship the calendar. But it's become, like many slurs, it's become a badge of honor, right, to be an Old Calendarist. Okay. But of course, for an ignorant person, the term may mean that the only objection we have to the state churches are that they've adopted the new calendar, or certain ones have adopted the new calendar, that if you're still in the old calendar, you're fine. Of course, we know better than that. Because great and historic churches which were on the old calendar, such as the Church of Russia, are in ecumenism. They haven't adopted the manifestation of ecumenism called the new calendar, but by remaining in communion with the new calendarists, they are saying that it is a matter of indifference. It doesn't matter whether you're old or new. We're all in this together, right? So even So remaining on the old calendar, but serving with people in the new calendar, you are actually enforcing the new calendarist doctrine, so to speak, that the calendar is a matter of indifference. It just doesn't matter. Nearly as disturbing as the heresy of ecumenism is the fact that many individuals with otherwise Orthodox beliefs have remained under ecumenist bishops, even though they vigorously disagree with these bishops on matters of faith. Now, these are the people he's going to be addressing in the article, and these are the people that we're interested in, right? I mean, the people who are just convinced modernists, who just love being in the OCA of the Antiochians because they can go on just being whatever they were before, because those groups are user-friendly. They can just be Protestants with an Eastern Rite veneer. Those people are not interested in our position, right? Because matters of dogma are not important to them. But there are still people, and as a matter of fact, recently our Metropolitan's began a whole video series to address, apparently he's had hundreds or even thousands of inquiries from people in the New Calendar Greek Church who are very concerned. So there are still people, there's the remnant, or the 7,000 not yet bowed the knee to Baal, who are still in the World Orthodox churches who are concerned about dogma and are concerned about the confession of faith. But they're held back from joining us either by ignorance, because they don't know we exist, or they're simply told, they're frightened by their leaders to say, well, they're schismatics, they're uncanonical, don't join them, they're crazy, they're wacky, they eat their babies, the things the Romans were saying about the early Christians, right? The kind of crazy accusations. So these are the people we're concerned about. These are people that Bishop Maximus is addressing this article to. Our friends who believe as we do, except that they believe they have to stay under a heretical hierarchy. And they're following teachers like this Father Basil or Father Peter Heers, who have invented a new innovative ecclesiology to justify their position. For the sake of convenience, we may style these individuals as conservative New Calendarists, although they would better be described as conservative adherents of world orthodoxy, since many of them still follow the patristic calendar. Obviously, if they're in the Moscow Patriarchate or they're in the Jerusalem Patriarchate, for example, they are the Serbian Patriarchate. They are following the old calendar, but they are in ecumenism. Under one name or another, they have a long history of failing to support those who follow the traditions of the fathers, of assailing them as schismatic, and claiming that though ecumenism is wrong, it is not so wrong as to warrant separating from bishops who preach and foster it. A number of diatribes have been written by these people, the conservative New Calendarists, against the faithful who have broken communion with the ecumenist bishops. Perhaps the most widely circulated is an article. This is prior to the Father Peter Heers era. Okay, now he's the poster boy for this position, but it's essentially the same arguments. Perhaps the most widely circulated is an article written several years ago by Father Basil Grigoriatis. That's because he was a monk. His name was Father Basilius. He was a monk of Grigorio Monastery in Manatos. That's why he's Grigoriatis. Entitled "The Anti-Patristic, the Stance of the Zealot Old Calendarists." This polemic sums up virtually all the arguments used against the Old Calendarists. Thus, to refute it entails a full justification of the position of the Orthodox and a confutation of its detractors. And notice, he's just calling us just the Orthodox. True Orthodox is a useful label, but we're just Orthodox. We're the Orthodox and they're not. That's the point. Okay. So this article is very useful because it refutes all the main arguments that have been used by, and what's curious and what's sad is that these conservative New Calendarists or conservative World Orthodox will spend more energy and passion attacking us who are teaching the faith than they will spend attacking the heretics and the innovators. And I think it's, fundamentally, forgive me, but I think it's cowardice. We're low-hanging fruit. They can attack us and get away with it. If they had the guts to really go after the innovators, they might lose their jobs or they might have a convenient car accident. It is said in Holy Scripture, "Rebuke a wise man, and he will love thee. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be yet wiser. Teach a just man, and he will increase in learning." It is the author's hope that the readers of this rejoinder, being wise, will understand the errors of this Father Basil and those of like mind, will sever communion with the ecumenists, and will adopt the stand of the Holy Fathers. So Bishop Maximus he's being upfront. He's saying, I'm writing this because I want you to break communion with those heretics, because I care about your salvation. I want you to be Orthodox, right? To be in the church. Part 1, canonical considerations, the status of uncondemned heretics, and this is the crux of the matter. Heretics have not yet been condemned by specific mechanism of canonical order, a council, so forth. Before examining any particular heresy, it will be useful to establish the Church's teaching on heresy in general, especially since this forms the crux of Father Basil's argument. Are heretics, before they are condemned by a council, part of the Church? And is it necessary, permissible, or forbidden to have communion with them? So is it necessary? Okay, the hardcore conservative New Calendar position is it's necessary, even though they're heretics, it's necessary to have communion with them. The middle position is it's permissible, even though it's not required, and the strict position is it's forbidden. You can't have communion with them. In addressing these questions, we turn to three sources of authority: the canons of the Church, the writings of the Holy Fathers, and the Church's actual practice and history. And this is very important. The author is doing something very important here. He's making clear that the canons cannot be interpreted in a vacuum. You have to understand the canons are actually very simple. And sometimes they're inscrutable, to tell the truth. Unless you know the historical reason they were written, and unless you know the phronema of the fathers who wrote them. And you know that from reading the writings of those fathers, and then reading the lives of those fathers, and how they responded in certain situations. So you can't just pick up the Pedalion, the rudder, the collection of the canons, and just start opening it up and saying, well, this canon says this canon says that. And actually, most people shouldn't deal with the Pedalion very often. I mean, it's important to have the collection of the canons and to be somewhat familiar with them, especially for the clergy. But it's very dangerous just to start. You can start just going through the way that evangelicals go through the Bible and just pick out proof texts and start inventing incredible arguments to support almost any position. So he's saying it's very important that we go to three sources, not just the canons, although the canons are necessary, obviously, but they're also the writings of the fathers and the Church's actual practice. How did the Church, in her wisdom, guided by the Holy Spirit, interpret these canons and interpret the writings of the Scriptures and the fathers and apply them to situations that may be analogous or somewhat similar to ours? Okay. Here we shall examine the two most relevant canons. The first and less explicit is the 31st Apostolic Canon. So if you open the collection of the canons, the Pedalion, the first collection will be the 45 Apostolic Canons of the Holy Apostles. This is the 31st, which forbids the Christian from breaking away from the bishop, except when the bishop has offended against piety and justice. Since the ecumenist bishops have offended in many ways against piety and justice, even when these terms are defined in the narrowest sense possible, this canon, despite its general language, by itself justifies the Orthodox in severing communion with them. I mean, we could do a week-long seminar, 8 hours a day, and not exhaust the examples of the gross violations of piety and justice performed by the state hierarchies of the last 100 years. Since the ecumenist bishops have offended so many ways against piety and justice, even when the terms are defined in the narrowest sense possible, this canon, despite its general language, by itself justifies the Orthodox in severing communion with them. We can stick our finger in the footnotes, because I think it's important to realize we have an author who's done a lot of homework and realize what his sources are. We have to start familiarizing ourselves. If we're serious students, we'll familiarize ourselves with the sources. Footnote 2. This is stated in the standard commentaries on the canon in the rudder. Now, the standard commentaries and the rudder and its commentaries were written before 1920, before the first violation that we're even going to talk about. So this dates the rudder. The editor of the rudder, as we have it, is Saint Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, who proposed in 1810. So they can't say, well, this is something you old calendars invented, stuck in the rudder. No, the standard editions of the rudder date from prior to the saint's repose in 1810, right? And the commentaries already say that this canon alone justifies breaking communion with those who have against piety and justice, right? Of course, later on, that piety and justice is going to be more narrowly defined, because it can't just be because the bishop, wore the wrong color vestments or or he was unjust to that clergyman. He deposed a clergyman unjustly. You can't. It has to be more. Otherwise, the church would be in total chaos all the time, right? But the church's, the history of the church, the practice of the church, has given parameters which define this apostolic, this might say very early or primitive term, piety and justice. All right. Now here's another canon. The second and more explicit canon is the 15th of the Second Council, which states, as for those persons, and this is the canon that the reams have been written about in the polemic, back and forth about this. As for those persons who on account of some heresy condemned by the holy councils or fathers withdraw themselves from communion with their president, meaning the leader of the synod, right, or the bishop of their diocese, who preaches heresy publicly and with a bare head in the church, such persons are not only not subject to any canonical penalty on account of their having walled themselves off from any and all communion with the one called a bishop, before any conciliar or synodical verdict has been rendered, but on the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy to enjoy the honor which befits them among Orthodox Christians. They have defied not bishops, but pseudo-bishops and pseudo-teachers. And they have not sundered the unity of the church with any schism, but on the contrary, they have been sedulous to rescue the church from schisms and divisions. This ruling provides the primary canonical, as distinct from a patristic or historical basis, for the position of the Old Calendar Church vis-a-vis world orthodoxy. Much of the polemic against the Orthodox Christians of the Old Calendar consists in denigrating, marginalizing, trivializing, or simply ignoring this canon, as well as we shall see from the following assertions of Father Basil. Okay. So assertion one. So Father Basil is going to start with a correct assertion. Here's the assertion that we can't argue with. Heretics who have been condemned by a council or outside the church, an Orthodox Christian may have communion with them. Those who do so fall under the same strictures as the heretics themselves. If they've been condemned by a council, you can have no communion with them. And if you do, you fall under the same strictures as the heretics themselves. Now, how Father Basil can assert this as being true and still be in communion with his bishops who are in communion with Rome or the World Council of Churches, I'm not sure. But they have their justifications. Reply. This initial and valid assertion is introduced by Father Basil not to any positive purpose, with a view to discredit those who break communion with the heretic who has not been synodically condemned. In fact, the passage he cites from the Fathers to support this valid assertion do not refer to condemned heretics, but simply to heretics in general. The text he quotes make no distinction between heretics who have been condemned by council and those who have not. And surprisingly, for there are no canons or patristic texts which state that one must remain in communion with heretics who have not yet been condemned by council. There's not a single. They could search all day long, every canonical passage under the sun, and they will never find a canon that forbids you from breaking communion with a heretic who has not yet been synodically condemned. The contrary, rather, is true. The Scriptures and the Fathers state that a heretic, simply by reason of his heresy, is self-condemned. St. Paul, in his epistle to Titus, declares explicitly, a man that is an heretic, after the first and second admonition, reject, knowing that that is such is subverted and sinneth, being condemned of himself. This is amply expanded upon in the writings of such fathers. Now, as St. Cyprian of Carthage, in the 3rd century, laid out the Church's definitive teaching on the subject. He stated that the heretic is of himself condemned and banished outside the fountains of paradise. Let's look at 5 and 6. That's St. Cyprian of Carthage, epistles 73 and 74. Oh, 7 is going to be 74. That's 73. These are the epistles of St. Cyprian of Carthage. Cyprian of Carthage, by the way, if you're doing your patristic studies, he's one of the key early fathers on ecclesiology, especially on his work on the unity of the church, De Unitate Ecclesiae, and on the baptism of heretics, are very key writings. And he's 3rd century, it's the year 250. If everywhere heretics are called nothing other than, this is St. Cyprian again, if everywhere heretics are called nothing other than adversaries and antichrists, if they are pronounced to be people to be avoided, and they're pronounced to be perverted and condemned of their own selves, wherefore is it that they should not be thought worthy of being condemned by us, since it is evident from the apostolic testimony that they are of their own selves condemned? That's St. Cyprian, Epistles 74. St. Cyprian does not allow for several faiths to coexist simultaneously within the church. The church has only one faith. Nor does he allow heretics to be within the church. If one becomes a heretic, by definition, he is found outside the church. St. Firmilian of Caesarea confirms his doctrine, writing, "All of the heretics, it is evident, were self-condemned, and have declared against themselves an inevitable sentence before the day of judgment." That's it looks like St. Cyprian there is quoting Firmilian. St. Cyprian hammers his point over and over. Heretics are outside the church by virtue of their heresy. Thus, St. Cyprian again. The Apostle Paul explains teaching and enjoining that a heretic must be avoided, as condemned of himself. That man will be guilty of his own ruin, who, not being cast out by the bishop, but of his own accord deserting from the church, is by heretical presumption condemned of himself. Again, Cyprian of Carthage, Epistle 74. There are many examples from church history. Now our author goes on. Many examples from church history in the lives of the saints that illustrate that the church views heretics as being outside the church even before they are condemned by a council. In the Disputation with Pyrrhus of St. Maximus the Confessor, we read that the Monothelite Patriarch Pyrrhus recanted of his error, and thus he united himself to the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Now Pyrrhus had not been condemned by a council, but he recanted his error, and St. Maximus says by this recantation he united himself to the church, which means that he had been outside the church. Right? That's St. Maximus the Confessor, Disputation with Pyrrhus, section 220. This took place in 645, before the local councils of Carthage, held later in the same year, and of Rome, held in 649, long before the Sixth Council of 681, all of which anathematized monothelitism. And Pyrrhus says personally the latter two councils. So Pyrrhus, when St. Maximus, early on in this controversy, Pyrrhus did recant for a while from monothelitism. And St. Maximus says when he recanted, he joined himself to the church. That means that St. Maximus, and this is before any of the councils condemned him. So the point is that St. Maximus regarded him as being outside the church, simply in virtue of his public. It was a very public heresy. These patriarchs were signing heretical documents that had been imposed by the emperors for political reasons, to pacify the Monophysites, hoping to get back Egypt and Syria from the Muslims. Again, St. Maximus declares declaring the Monothelites, they have repeatedly excommunicated themselves from the church and are completely unstable in the faith. Additionally, they have been cut off and stripped of the priesthood by the local council held in Rome. A local council held in Rome deposed them. Not an ecumenical council. Of course, the radical papers would say, "Oh, that's because it's the Pope. He can do it." But we're Orthodox. We're not. That's a different argument. It's a different discussion. Okay. What mysteries, St. Maximus says, then can they perform? Or what spirit descends upon those whom they ordain? St. Maximus is a Matthewite, he's saying that the heretics are graceless. And prior to an ecumenical conciliar condemnation, they're condemned. We know that St. Martin of Rome was a valiant ally of St. Maximus, and they both suffered for their struggle against monothelitism in the 7th century. That's footnote 12. St. Demetrius of Rostov, the great collection of the lives of the saints. They're quoting the lives of the saints. Now, remember, when you're talking to a more modernist New Calendarist, he won't accept the lives of the saints as evidence for anything. Right? Because the modernists, a priest who's a product of St. Vladimir's seminary, for example, will not accept the lives of the saints as evidence for anything. They'll say, well, those are all fabrications. They're charming novels written, based on a little kernel of truth, and you can't accept. But that in itself shows that these people are so modernist that you can't really talk to them, okay? Because they don't accept traditional sources of the church's teaching, okay? Because Father Schmemann said so, or someone like him. Okay. Likewise, Saint Hypatius, abbot of a monastery in Constantinople, and upset of the heretic Nestorius. Okay, so we've talked about St. Maximus in the 7th century with monothelitism. Now we're going back to the beginning of the 5th century, and the patriarch Nestorius, who was teaching against Theotokos, right, and teaching against the actual hypostatic union of the two natures in Christ. St. Hypatia says, from the time I learned that he had said unrighteous things about the Lord, I have no longer been in communion with him. I do not commemorate his name, for he is not a bishop. Saying he is not. Now, at that time, Nestorius was wearing the robes, and he was preaching in front of the emperor in the old Hagia Sophia. And he was the official, the official patriarch, right? St. Hypatia says he is not a bishop. And this man is a saint. This is not an isolated expostulation from some irritated ignoramus. Oh, he's not a bishop. I mean, I've had irritated parish council members in my old parish say that I'm not a priest. I had a wonderful council president who said, Father Stephen, when I'm finished with you, you will be a priest for dogs. But when I'm finished with you, you'll be a priest for dogs. It was a great moment. I'll never forget it. One of those things you can, write a scene in a novel, based on that. So there are irritable, ignorant people who say, well, he's not a priest because, for whatever reason. But this is a saint making a very solemn statement about his bishop, based on the bishop's publicly preaching a terrible heresy, right? Denying the hypostatic union of the two natures in Christ. And so it's very serious. This is serious. This isn't just a marginal fanatic fulminating in a fit of temper against the bishop. Right? He's making a very specific judgment inspired by the Holy Spirit. I do not commemorate his name, for he is not a bishop. Okay. 13. That's the life of Saint Hypatius. In Greek, the life of Saint Hypatius, and in French, Vie d'Hypatios in Source Chrétien. Right. So Saint Hypatius said this before Nestorius had been condemned by the Third Council, well before conciliar condemnation. Again, many years before the Seventh Council. So now we're in the era of iconoclasm, right? Now we're talking about the 8th century, the first wave of iconoclasm. St. Stephen the New told the iconoclast Bishop Theodosius, here's what St. Stephen says, such are your decrees against the veneration of the holy icons, which were promulgated not by the sons of the Catholic Church, but by godless adulterers. He's calling the bishops who promulgated these things godless adulterers. They're godless, right? They're atheist. I mean, I'm sure the Greek is atheistos. Certain is the prophet's saying, the rulers of the people were assembled together with false shepherds and hirelings against Christ and his precious icon. 14, that's the life of St. Stephen the New by Stephen the Deacon. From the French is also, there's a French edition, La Vie de Etienne de Lejeune, by Stephen the Deacon. Okay. In fact, the entire first session of the Seventh Ecumenical Council was devoted to how to receive the iconoclasts back into the church. So they were discussing how to receive them back into the church, and they'd never been condemned by a previous council. But they were already regarded as being outside the church. And these people were guilty of just one heresy, iconoclasm, whereas the ecumenists are guilty of every heresy that they've proclaimed that they're with. Like Patriarch Athenagoras, who lives the anathemas. Now he became guilty of all the heresies of the Latins since the time of the schism. See? The heretics were assumed to be already outside the church prior to the beginning of the council, as the petitions of the heretical bishops make clear. Here's an example. Theodore, one of the iconoclast repentant iconoclasts. Theodore, Bishop of Myra, was then brought forward. He said, even I, a sinner and unworthy, having made deep inquiry and research and having chosen the better part, to entreat of God and your holiness that among the rest I also, though a sinner, may be united to the Catholic Church. Euthemius, Bishop of Sardis, said, blessed be God who hath united him to the Catholic Church. Then John, legate of the See of Antioch, said, most Holy Father, it is the question with many of us, in what manner we ought to receive those who return from heresy. Wherefore we request this holy and sacred council to give order that the books of the Holy Fathers may be produced, that we may search, examine them, and to obtain perfect certainty as to the manner in which these persons should be received, for our mind is not made up on this matter. 50, that's in Muncie, is a collection. There are two large standard collections of the fathers, and that's the Minier, the Greek and Latin fathers, and also Mansi is another. These are 19th century Western European scholars who did enormous work collecting all the Greek and Latin fathers into editions at that time. That's these are all in the original. It says Mansi or Minier, they're in the original. They're in the Greek or the Latin. The council, now Father Bishop Maximus goes on. The council then read many testimonies of how the heretics had been received in the past, without discriminating between those who had been condemned by council and those who had not. This shows quite clearly that the fathers of the council made no distinction between the two in this connection. In the course of the conversation, John, vicar of the see of Antioch, declared, "Heresy separates every man from the church." The Holy Council replied, "That is very evident." This observation is still evident to the true Orthodox, but Father Basil and company seem to have forgotten it. I think our author is indulging very justified irony. At the end of the deliberation, the Holy Council said, "Let the bishops now step forward and read their several recantations as they now desire to enter the Catholic Church." Tarasius, that's the patriarch, the Orthodox patriarch, St. Tarasius. Tarasius replied, "Let them read their recantations now that these 2 points in question have been fully examined, namely the reception of those who come from the ranks of heresy to the Holy Catholic Church, and also those who have been ordained by heretics." The heretics read their recantations, and St. Tarasius said, "As they have by their recantation made known their profession, let their reception take place at some future session if there be no other cause of hindrance." Now our author goes on. Finally, the council, in its definition of faith, officially declared the Orthodox position on heretics who have not yet been condemned by a council, stating, "For they, the iconoclasts, have dared to slander the God-befitting beauty of the sacred offerings, being called priests, while in reality they are not." Since the above proceedings of the Seventh Council reflect at the highest level the Church's understanding of the status of heretics uncondemned by a council, that understanding must be regarded as indisputable for the Orthodox. To maintain, as does Father Basil and now Father Peter hears, that such uncondemned heretics remain members of the Church, much less the canonical leaders of the Church, whom you must commemorate, right, completely contradicts the stance of the Seventh Council. Okay, assertion 2 by Father Basil. An ecumenical council must condemn those who are preaching a heresy in order for the Orthodox to be justified in separating communion from the heretics. Not only a council, an ecumenical council. Reply. A direct refutation of this assertion on our part is unnecessary, as Father Basil abandons his own contention here when he later concedes that the condemnation of a local council suffices to justify a break with the heretics. In the same article, he contradicted himself. Right. Then he goes further, admitting that in certain cases, communion with heretics was actually severed before synodal condemnation of any sort, that this is allowed by the 15th canon of the First Second Council. Nevertheless, he qualifies these admonitions by pretending that no sacred council or Holy Fathers ever imposed the interruption of ecclesiastical communion with heretics on Orthodox followers prior to the synodal decision. To this contention we shall return shortly. From the above, it is clear that while he does not shrink from labeling the Orthodox as schismatic, that's us, this author, this Father Basil and also this Father Peter hears now, they don't shrink from labeling us as schismatics, because we've separated ourselves from the ecumenist bishops before those bishops have been synodically condemned. But Father Basil is quite confused as to what the real criteria are that would validate such a break. They're not even sure what would validate such a break, and yet they say, but it's not what you guys have done. We know that. See? He allows that in the past the Orthodox justly separated themselves from heretics in circumstances similar to those prevailing today. Actually, not as dire, actually, as those prevailing today. But he denies the present-day Orthodox may do so. He says, no, you can't leave, you're trapped. Stay where you are. Now, the 15th canon of the First Second Council praises those who break communion with heretics. From this, it is evident that such people act rightly, not wrongly, and that it is a grievous sin to denounce them for following the explicit injunctions of the canons and the Holy Fathers. Two of the Church's primary modes of explication are encomium and vituperation. This is very important. In the rhetoric of the Fathers, of all the Church literature, it is not only syllogistic argumentation that's used to explain the church's teaching. There are two very good, important, powerful, legitimate modes: encomium and vituperation. You praise those who are worthy of praise, and you assail those who are worthy of being attacked. That if you read, because of the current effeminate and effete understanding of Christian charity, people think that any kind of polemic that indulges in any kind of vituperation is inherently uncharitable. But that's not true, because it may take a real invective to get through to somebody, or a real invective to grab people's attention. And there are actually many of the great examples of rhetoric in history, many examples of the writings of the fathers are magnificent examples of the most violent invective. See? Because someone who is destroying the souls of millions of people needs to be roundly condemned, right? If you're attacking someone who's committing a grievous evil, but you make your attack so anodyne that no one's emotions will be disturbed, you're not doing your job. Okay. That's a little footnote of vituperation. So Bishop Maximus rightly says that two of the Church's primary modes of explication, of explaining her teachings, are encomium, praising the saints, praising those who teach her right, and vituperation, assailing those who are the enemies of the Church with justly deserved invective. The Church praises those who lead her children towards God. She reviles those who turn her children away from God. Her approval of those who wall themselves off from heretical bishops is powerful testimony to the fact that the stand of the old calendarists is encouraged by Holy Tradition. It is evident from even the most cursory reading of the canon that the Orthodox are permitted to separate from the bishop who preaches heresy. That's the least of it. We're permitted. From this, it follows that whenever bishops openly profess heresy, the Orthodox are automatically justified from breaking communion with them. Of course, you have to make sure he's preaching heresy. You don't just hear you don't hear one sermon by a parish priest, make a phone call to the bishop, and the bishop puts you off, then suddenly you break communion. There has to be a repeated pattern, right? And what does St. Paul say? After first or second admonition, reject. So there has to be a process of admonition, a process of reproving, of seeking redress, of seeking correction, seeking at least a clarification. Maybe he didn't mean what I thought he meant, you see. But when it's very clear, especially in our case, this has been going on for 100 years. It's not generational. There's no. It's absurd. It's utterly obtuse, utterly obdurate to say these people are not involved in heresy, right? That they're either preaching or they're in communion with those preaching heresy. Okay. It is evident from this, it follows that whenever bishops openly profess heresy, the Orthodox are automatically justified from breaking communion with them. Here we arrive at the central point. The position of the Orthodox Church is in actuality much stronger. It is not only praiseworthy, but obligatory to separate from heretical bishops. It's obligatory. Right. A careful reading shows that this is precisely what the canon demands, for it labels hierarchs who promulgate heresy as pseudo-bishops and pseudo-teachers. So what the conservative new calendars like this Father Basil or Father Peter Hears is saying is, yes, he's a pseudo-bishop, but you must commemorate him. Such language can only mean that it is these bishops have divided the church, that is, they have fallen away from the church. For this reason, they're no longer bishops at all, but pseudo-bishops, bishops in name only. Metropolitan Philaret, in one of his sorrowful epistles, speaks of the Moscow Patriarch bishops as those who occupy sees with the ancient names of churches. But they're not bishops; they're men who have the names of these sees. Right? Like the Pope of Rome, he has the most honored name in the church hierarchy, but he's not really a bishop. To put it more simply, if they were true and Orthodox bishops, they would not be false bishops. The law of non-contradiction, right? The fact that the canon resorts to such strong language mandates the Orthodox to separate from the heretical bishops. For in order to belong to the church, one must be under bishops who themselves are part of the church. It seems so basic, doesn't it? To be in the church, to be under a bishop is part of the church. Unless you don't believe in bishops, unless you're a Protestant, or, a Presbyterian or Congregationalist or something like that. It is spiritually disastrous to remain in communion with a bishop who does not rightly divide the word of truth. The bishop teaches and leads the people to Christ. But if he teach falsely, he leads the people away from Christ. He is the icon of Christ, and it is as an Orthodox bishop that he teaches instead of Christ. To advocate remaining in communion with a heretical bishop simply because he's not been condemned by a council is to subvert or even render null the entire meaning of hierarchy in the church. The virtue or faith of the laity does not correct the bishop's lack of Orthodox faith. This is very important. The virtue or faith of the laity, and we could also add the lower clergy, does not correct the bishop's lack of Orthodox faith. It doesn't work like that. The bishop's misbelief pollutes the laity. Why? Because the church is hierarchical. The grace flows to us through the hierarchy. Right? In practice, we see this taking place in ecumenist churches, where the laity has been drenched in ecumenist propaganda for so long, the majority of them do not even have an inkling of what is the true Orthodox teaching and what constitutes the church. And if you're like me in the trenches, and we're dealing with, especially when I had our parish in the Detroit area, and we had so many New Calendar Greeks visiting our church regularly, and when you talk to them about this, they evinced absolutely no understanding of what constitutes the criteria for understanding where the church is. They may have been emotionally disturbed when the cardinal stood in the altar with the bishop on Christmas and that kind of thing, right? It disturbed them emotionally. They knew their gut feeling was, this is weird, this is wrong, we don't like it. But when you said, this constitutes heresy, it didn't, because they've been drenched so long, they were so used to it. By the time we came to our parish in St. Clair Shores, that was the year 2001. So the people who were the pillars of the New Calendar parishes were very young people when Athenagoras lifted the anathemas, right? This has been going on for a long time. So they're so, what Father Maximus is saying here is that they're so inured to it. They're so confused that they just don't know these. They can't even think in these categories. And this is true also a lot of the clergy. This isn't just the lay people. When you meet, you try to have a discussion of this with a Greek New Calendar or an OCA clergyman or something. There's just it's not simply obduracy. It is complete incomprehension of these things. Okay. Even where the process is not so naked and advanced, the very fact that the laity accept these pseudo-bishops necessarily means that the laity, they tacitly accept and acquiesce to the misbelief of the bishops. Okay, so they're tacitly accepting, they're going along with it, they're being silent. They're going along with it. And this has an effect on the soul, right? There's the old legal maxim, right? Qui tacet consentire videtur. He who is silent appears to agree. Okay? And this is a fundamental law of human communication, right? So you're silent for generations about your bishop being the Royal Council of Churches. It really affects yours. It's bound to have a disastrous effect on your soul, right? He goes on now. Our author goes on to quote Saint Cyprian of Carthage. Here's Saint Cyprian. We find that in such wickedness, not only the leaders and originators, but also the partakers, are destined to punishment unless they have separated themselves from the communion of the wicked. As the Lord by Moses commands, saying, separate yourselves from the tents of those most hardened men. Touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be consumed in their sins. Book of Numbers, 16:26. St. Cyprian goes on. And what the Lord had threatened by Moses, he fulfilled it, that whosoever had not separated himself from Korah and Dathan and Abiram. Remember, this is the revolt against Moses by Korah and Dathan and Abiram. Immediately suffered punishment for his impious communion, by which example it is shown and proved that all will be liable to guilt as well as its punishment, who with irreligious boldness mingle themselves with schismatics in opposition to prelates and priests. All are absolutely joined with the leaders in punishment who have been contaminated by their crime. And by the schismatics, he means the bishops and priests who are opposing, right? And by bishops and priests, he means the Orthodox. Okay, that's 20. That's in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 5. That's the red. If you have the Eerdmans set, that's the red set. The red set with the red binding on the spine. Volume 5, page 400. Okay. Our author goes on. Beyond this, let us consider a few of the countless perplexities that arise if it is permissible but not obligatory to break communion with the heretical bishops. Side by side, yet out of communion with each other, two groups will exist, one headed by Orthodox bishops, the other by heretics. Which of these is the church? Or if both together constitute the church, ought they not to be in communion? But then it would be praiseworthy for the Orthodox to be in communion with heretics, whereas we have already seen that the canons praise the Orthodox for breaking communion with heretics. Again, if heretical bishops are really still Orthodox because they've not been synodically condemned, how could one dare to break communion with them, as did the saints? How can a faction headed by openly heretical bishops be the church, which, as the apostle teaches, is the pillar and foundation of the truth? Okay. But now he goes on. Interesting and important as these questions may be, they are rendered irrelevant because in the current situation, because the heresies in question have been synodically condemned. The Gregorian calendar was anathematized synodically in 1583. And multiple times thereafter, people say, well, the calendar is not a heresy. The new calendar has been condemned synodically more times than any other false teaching in history. There are more synodical condemnations of the calendar, and there's a magisterial refutation of the new calendar by Chrysostomos Papadopoulos, who later was one of the culprits who instituted the new calendar in Athens in 1924. So it's a roundly condemned, anathematized, despised innovation for centuries, right? Since 1583. Ecumenism was condemned by the Russian Church abroad in 1983. Now, some would imagine that anathemas laid down in the past have to be reimposed by a modern council in order to be valid. If this were the case, we would have to affirm that were someone to become a monophysite or Roman Catholic today, he would remain part of the church until a contemporary synod of bishops reimposed the anathemas on him, which is ridiculous. Right? We don't have to keep reinventing the wheel, right? These things are anathematized. This would mean that truth has an expiration date. This is very well put. And that the church, in order to ensure that no heretic remained inside her, would have to hold an ecumenical council every year, or even more frequently, perhaps, right? But the truth of the matter is that an anathema, once pronounced, is forever valid against all who fall under it. Its efficacy, does not depend upon its being reactivated by a new council every time an individual group espouses the heresy in question. This is supported by the Acts of the Sixth Council, which declared, to those who have taught, do teach, or will teach, have taught, do teach, or will teach, that there is one will and one energy in the incarnate dispensation of Jesus Christ, anathema. In other words, not just the living heretics, but all those who at any time in the future will adopt the heresy are under the anathema. Right? Otherwise, anathema would be useless. Right? It wouldn't protect anyone, except the contemporary generation. Right? This explains why the church holds the anathemas pronounced in the 16th century against those who accept a new calendar to be just as valid and binding today as when they were issued. This is why contemporary new calendars must be regarded as falling under the already existing anathemas, declaring that whoever accepts a new calendar to be outside the church. Assertion 3. Now we're back to this Father Basil.
Before we go on,
yes,
I have a question about the nature of the new calendar and its relationship to the Gregorian calendar. I haven't investigated this, I've heard it said that the new calendarists will say, well, the new calendar that was promulgated in the 20s is not the Gregorian calendar. It is based on new astronomical calculations meant to ensure astronomical accuracy of some kind. And because it is the canonical creation of an Orthodox church, it is not the Gregorian calendar, it is not the Papist calendar, and in fact, if the Catholics don't do some kind of new astronomical calculations, eventually the so-called Orthodox new calendar and the Gregorian calendar will once again diverge because of the difference in their calculations. And because it is not the Gregorian calendar, it does not fall under the anathemas promulgated against the Gregorian calendar by the Orthodox churches. So, I'm wondering...
They would do well in a rabbinical school of Talmudic studies.
Yes. Have you heard this argument?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
This is old canard. If you want to know the why was this calendar introduced, it's explained in the encyclical to the Churches of Christ Everywhere of 1920, which predates the calendar change by 4 years. Mm-hmm. This is an infamous document that kicked off the century of ecumenism. And in 1920, the Ecumenical Patriarchate issued an encyclical address to the churches of Christ everywhere, meaning not to the Orthodox, but to the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. The very title is heretical, because it's calling them churches of Christ. And it makes proposals to bring about union of the churches. And the very first proposal is a common calendar. The very purpose of the new calendar was to facilitate, and they can call it the revised Gregorian or revised Julian all they want. The actual effect is that their Christmas is the same as the heretics, and their Annunciation is the same as the heretics, and their Transfiguration is the same as the heretics. That's the point. And actually, Father Maximus will address that very argument later in this article.
Good.
He says they should call it the revised Gregorian calendar, not the revised Julian calendar. Whereas they've even gone farther away from the Orthodox calendar. They're worse than the Gregorian calendar. So they're anathematized squared. It's farther away than the Papist calendar. Okay, so it's a silly argument. Arguments like that are arguments by people who don't have a real argument, right? And they're grasping at straws. They're looking for some legalistic out. If they're looking at the spirit of the law, they'd say, why they introduce it? Who's introduced this thing and why? Well, it's so evident. We know who introduced it and we know why. They said why. To facilitate ecumenism. So, anyway, I'm sorry for being sarcastic, but it's just so dumb. Just tired. You get tired. I'm old. I'm tired of things that are so dumb. it's like Talleyrand once said. It's worse than a crime. It's a mistake. It's just so stupid. All right.
But I have a question
too. Go on.
While we're in the question here.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about heresy.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, as it mentioned here, that in 1983, the Russian Church abroad
anathematized ecumenism.
Condemned ecumenism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is condemning it mean the same as calling the heresy?
Yes.
So if they did call it a heresy, how they end up joining the?
Well, we're going to get to that. Okay, that's a very important question, and we're doing right now. What we're going to do is go through Father Maximus's article to lay out basic ecclesiological principles, and then we're going to have to go through the history of the Greek Church and the history of the Russian Church, and show how we got to where we are today. And when I say Greek and Russian, I don't mean to exclude the Romanians. I don't mean to exclude the Bulgarians or the Serbs. It's just that those two have been the leading players in all this, right? Both for good and for ill. And although the Romanians are actually, at this moment, the Romanians are the largest true Orthodox group with about 1 million faithful in Romania. They have to be reckoned with. But the Romanians are extremely pious. They're extremely correct in their confession of faith. But they have not been engaged in this controversy on the world stage, as have the Russian and the Greek churches. So I'm not excluding all. I love the Romanians. I mean, all praise to the Romanians for their wonderful piety, their stance for orthodoxy. But it's just not. But examining their history isn't as useful because they've not been engaged on the pan-Orthodox stage, as have the two sides of this controversy in the Russian and the Greek churches. Okay. And the Russian and Greek stories intertwine because of the involvement of the Russian Church abroad in the Greek calendar movement, which we're going to get to later on. Okay, but we will get to that. Yes, they do fall under their own anathema. Everyone who joined Moscow falls under the 83 anathema. They anathematize themselves. That is an ineluctable conclusion. Okay. Assertion 3. This is Father Basil's assertion. Between the first appearance of the heresy and its final condemnation, a period of time may lapse during which the Church strives to bring the wayward bishops back to a correct confession of faith. Reply. It is, now Father Maximus replies to this, it is self-evident that in the very nature of things, time must elapse between the appearance of a heresy and its condemnation. Obviously, the condemnation would not precede the heresy's invention. Somehow, from this obvious fact, Father Basil draws the unfounded conclusion that it is irresponsible to break communion with heretical bishops before they are synodically condemned. What the correct course of action is has already been shown. He's already our authors already demonstrate that you break communion prior to synodical condemnation. So the fact that there's a time lapse until an actual synodical condemnation takes place does not change that. At this point, an interesting question arises. Exactly when should synodical condemnation of heretics occur? Now, that's another question. To this, Father Basil cannot provide a coherent answer. He can only insist that both the breaking of communion and the synodical condemnation must be postponed as long as possible. This assertion, it is hardly an argument, he just makes that assertion, may easily be reduced to absurdity along the following lines. It's better to be inside the church than to outside the church. Everybody agrees with that, right? But according to Father Basil, a heretic remains inside the church till a synod condemns him. Thus, the church should always refrain from condemning the heretical bishops so as not to put them and their innocent followers outside the church. That's not nice. Keep them in the church. Hey, let's keep them in. I haven't read this article in a long time. It's really wonderful. For according to Father Basil's theology, the ecclesial status of heretics depends upon the whims of the Orthodox, upon whether the Orthodox choose to condemn a given heresy. Hey, guys, are we going to condemn this? Nah, let's let it slide. See? And not on the beliefs of the heretics themselves. Right? The beliefs of the heretics are just, well, that's secondary. What's important is that the Orthodox have to decide to condemn them. Or maybe we'll decide not to. Since Father Basil would exclude the heretics from membership in the church solely on the basis of their condemnation by a council rather than on their confession of faith, such a council in theory might never convene if the Orthodox want to continue their economy towards the heretics forever. All this because Father Basil insists upon an imaginary dichotomy between an Orthodox confession and membership in the church, in which you can have the heretical confession, a public, unrepented, heretical confession for many years and still be in the church, if a certain procedure hasn't taken place to publicly kick you out. That's footnote 23.
Sounds like a very Latin sort of legalism. If the correct forms haven't been followed, spiritual realities do not take place.
Yes, it's the magic poof moment hasn't happened, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now he's addressing in footnote 23. It's an important footnote because he is addressing possible objections. One might protest that, in fact, many individuals within the church have taught heresy, and yet communion with them was not broken. For example, Origen or Theodore of Mopsuestia. We know who Origen was, right? The great 3rd century catechist and apologist, theologian, who was posthumously condemned not until the 5th Ecumenical Council. So he died in the 3rd century and wasn't condemned until the 6th century. Or Theodore of Mopsuestia was posthumously condemned. Theodore of Mopsuestia's scripture commentaries were open to a Nestorian interpretation. He too was not condemned until the 5th Council. Okay. But what is essential here is that such individuals spoke precisely as individuals, not as synods, and that the church at large was not infected with their errors. Nevertheless, Origen, who was only a priest, was condemned while yet living by his bishop, Demetrius. And again, at the 5th Council, the errors of Theodore of Mopsuestia did not come to general notice until after his death. When his views were examined closely, he was also condemned at the 5th Council. That's was 100 and something years after his repose. The unity of Orthodox confession and membership in the church refers to public confession of faith insofar as it is examined by the church. A person's private opinions, however, erroneous, do not separate him from the church, although he'll have to answer for them to God. In other words, Origen's never tried to impose. Origen was an individual theologian who did not try to impose this on the whole church, his strange teachings. And Theodore of Mopsuestia was a great scripture commentator, some of whose views within his writings were capable of Nestorian construction. So he was finally condemned in the 5th Council. All right, let's go back. That's a lot different from Athenagoras praying with Pope Paul VI, right? Giant photo op saying it's all good now. All your heresies are not heresies. Right. Now, Father Basil explains the inevitable transitional period preceding the severance of communion with heretics as an exercise in economy. It is indeed prudence and legitimate economy to refrain from separating from bishops until one has ascertained definitely that they are heretics. You don't want to just jump to a conclusion. You don't read one sermon or one article and say, the bishop's a heretic, I break communion. Okay. But if in this context, economy is understood as an imperative to maintain unity at all cost, outward unity, at all cost, the Church's self-understanding has been fundamentally violated. Well, by economy, we're going to stay with these ecumenists for generations. That's a very strange economy. Unity has been placed above truth. So, of course, it's a false unity. The order of theology has been inverted, whereas human togetherness is more important than truth. For unity proceeds from truth, not truth from unity. The latter idea being the wishful thinking of the ecumenists. At this point, Father Basil seemed to be advocating not a legitimate economy, but a dangerous abuse, a subspecies of the heresy of ecumenism. Father Basil is an ecumenist because he's saying we're going to stay with the heretics as long as possible. In this, we and the heretics are together in the church, and you Orthodox who aren't with us are outside the church. For ecumenism is spiritual fellowship with those who believe other than we do. Therefore, those who say they reject ecumenism but maintain a communion with the ecumenists most exactly for the definition of ecumenists. I call this ecumenism on steroids. Like for the ecumenists to have prayers with the Pope or the Royal Council of Churches, that's ecumenism. But then for those who have Orthodox opinion, then to celebrate with the ecumenists, well, that's ecumenism squared, because they claim to be the Orthodox. But we're going to stay with the ecumenists. It's ecumenism, upon ecumenism. The primary reason, our author goes on, the primary reason for the delay preceding severance of communion with heresy is to allow time for assessment of the heresy, of course. Sometimes it is unclear whether heresy has definitely established itself among those who until recently had been members of the church. Before the Orthodox break communion with heretics, several things must happen. First, the Orthodox learn that a heresy is in fact being preached. They look for positive proof of the heresy. They do not make a decision based on innuendo. While this may seem obvious, it is difficult for a modern reader to conceive of the slowness of travel and difficulty of communications in the ancient medieval world. Information could take months, even years, to reach one region from another, and often was transmitted in garbled form. This fact alone explains many of the delays in breaking communion with heretics in the past. Next, the Orthodox, both the clergy and the fullness of the faithful, but especially the saints, ascertain whether an actual heresy is being promulgated or whether there is merely some incidental abuse taking place. In addition, they determine whether the heresy is being preached deliberately or simply out of ignorance or careless use of language. Somebody may be careless. You say, well, Your Grace or Father, please clarify that. And they say, oh yeah, that's right. That could be open to a heretical interpretation. I better make that clear. Then they explain it, then they're fine, right? Finally, the Orthodox publicly rebuke the heretics, and the heretics reply by rejecting or at least ignoring the Orthodox teaching in the matter in question. Now, of course, insofar as ecumenism is concerned, we've been rebuking them for decades. And they not only do not accept the rebukes, but they accuse us of all kinds of things for rebuking them. These steps indicate that breaking communion with heretics is a process, one that may take years to complete. Indeed, one part of the church may come to an understanding that the issue is before another part and break communion with the heretics first, so that there may be a time when the one local church is simultaneously in communion both with the heretics and with the more zealous, perceptive, or well-informed Orthodox who have already broken communion with the heretics. Sometimes also the successor to a bishop who has declared heresy retracts the heresy, only for it to be reinstated by his successor. Our bishop publicly honors clergy who are preaching heresy without himself espousing any definite heretical position and so forth, all of which creates confusion and further retards or hastens the time it takes the Orthodox to break communion with the heretical hierarchy. A number of circumstances could cause confusion. The process of division may often be protracted and may only enter the wider conscience of the church gradually. Obviously, if the modern quickening of the pace of life in general and of communications in particular would have any effect in this sphere, it would accelerate the speed at which the church recognizes heresy and reacts to it, which we find out right away, and we don't have to dig it up because they brag about it, right? It's on their websites. This encyclical of 1920, that I'm talking about, for example, or the lifting of the anathemas, or the Balamand Agreement, these are all proudly trumpeted on the websites of their ecumenical patriarchate. Father Basil, however, takes this period of time in which the church comes to understand that a heresy is being preached and extrapolates from it a rule whereby the faithful who fully understand the erroneousness of the heresy in question are required to stay in communion with the heretics. He's taking the fact that there has to be a period of time when you ascertain this, just out of prudence, right? You wait, you find out if it's really true. He says, because that's true, you must stay with them indefinitely. Because I guess he means you could never know. Like you'll never even know if they're really heretics, so you have an ecumenical council. Right? This is a perversion, a dishonest and misleading interpretation of history that twists the actions of the Holy Fathers into meaning the exact opposite of what they intended. I think that's the end of assertion 3, and I think we've been over an hour, so I think it's a good time to quit, and we'll begin with...
I might point out,
yes.
Assertion 4 is a very short section, and that would end part 1.
You're right.
So that might be a logical place to end.
You're right. Let's go on to assertion 4. Assertion 4. It is impermissible to break communion over the violation of the canons, such as praying with heretics, not over heresy per se. So he says, yes, they're praying with the heretics, but they're not heretics, so you can't break communion with them.
Because it's merely a violation of the canons to pray with heretics.
It's merely a violation of the canons to pray with heretics. Okay. So our author replies, this statement may or not be true depending upon exact circumstances, a discussion which could itself be the subject of a treatise. But even if we assume the assertion to be true in the present case, it is nonetheless irrelevant because we have broken communion with the New Councils and Ecumenists precisely because they are heretics. They don't just pray with heretics, they are heretics. Not merely because they flagrantly violate the canons. Nevertheless, it should be noted that canons are written with various aims and presuppositions. Some canons deal with morality, others with administration, still others with proper church order. Certain canons, however, address the relationship of Christians with heretics or pagans. This isn't just housekeeping. These canons are not merely rules for the church order. They are practical expressions of the church's ecclesiology and self-understanding, which they have dogmatic consequences. And if it's dogmatic, it has soteriological consequences. To break canons such as these indicates a lack of understanding or even a denial of Orthodox ecclesiology. It's a denial of the church. In particular, the church, through a number of canons, forbids praying with heretics or accepting their baptism. These canons translate into real-life terms the patristic doctrine of the church. That is, that the church is truly the body of Christ. That as Christ is one, and in him there is no division, so also the church is one, and there can be no division of it into opposing parts. But to pray with heretics and accept their sacraments is to recognize that they are part of the same body, for Christian unity is wrought in the mysteries and made manifest in worship. There's an ancient maxim, an axiomatic assumption of church life is lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of praying is the law of believing. Who you pray with shows what you believe. Who you pray with, how you pray, shows what you believe. The ecumenist violation of the canons in question is proof in practice of their heresy. It's the heresy in practice. Since the fundamental supposition of ecumenism is that various heretical bodies are in some real, albeit perfect way, part of the church. That's the whole basis. That's why they're praying together, because they've already come to believe that they're all really part of the church. Okay. By being in the World Council of Churches, they're proclaimed that witch doctors and radical lesbian feminist theologians are part of the church. When a heretic implements his false belief by violating the canons, which are designed to hinder his heresy, it becomes doubly manifest that he is a heretic. Okay. So there are canons and there are canons. I mean, I've actually had really dumb conversations, I've had this word dumb conversations, or read dumb polemics from new calendarists who say, well, there's a canon that forbids giving communion with a spoon. So if you give him the spoon, you're a heretic. Ha ha ha. And it's silly, right? These are people who aren't thinking clearly. Obviously, there are canons that directly, as Father says, as the bishop says, directly flow from the Church's self-understanding. Others are matters of discipline or housekeeping, right? Maintaining order. Are important, of course, and we don't violate them at will just because that's not a dogma, right? But there are some canons that impinge directly upon the Church's expression of the dogma of that she's the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And obviously, praying with witch doctors at the Assisi gatherings is a pretty flagrant proclamation of what you think the Church is, of what Patriarch Bartholomew, for example, thinks the Church is. Okay, so thank you, George, for that. That is a good place to stop. Part 2 is the new calendar. I'm going to go into this whole new calendar thing and all this folderol about the revised Julian calendar, and we didn't change the Paschalians, so it doesn't matter, and all this farrago of casuistry.